The last lantern on the porch of Hadley's Mercantile was sputtering when Marcella Graves finally looked up and realized she was nearly alone. Nearly. The word lodged itself somewhere beneath her ribs like a splinter she could not quite reach. The music had stopped an hour ago, the fiddle player packing away his instrument with the satisfied yawn of a man who had done his work and earned his supper. The long tables that had groaned under pies and corn bread and sweet potato pudding now bore nothing but crumbs and the ghostring stains of tin cups. Somewhere across town, the laughter of departing families still drifted on the dry October wind, fading like smoke, leaving behind the kind of silence that pressed against the eardrums and asked uncomfortable questions. Marcella had been standing at the edge of the emptied yard, arms folded tight across her chest, not from cold but from the shock of it, the specific, humiliating shock of a woman who has just been told something she did not wish to know. Her cheeks were still flushed with it. The ghost of Thomas Aldrich's words were still burning in the air in front of her face, nearly visible, nearly tangible, the way cruel words sometimes are in the seconds after they are spoken. He had said he was promised to Margaret Colton of Abilene. He had said it with the polished ease of a man who had rehearsed the sentence many times, who had understood all along that this evening, this social, this night of dancing and sweetened lemonade and stolen glances was always going to end this way. He had asked Marcella to dance 3 times. He had held her hand when they walked to the punch bowl. He had smiled at her with those white teeth and said, "You are the most handsome woman in Caldwell County, Marcella Graves." And she had believed him because she was 26 years old, and this was the Kansas frontier in the year 1878, and a woman who ran her dead father's dry goods supply route alone did not often get to feel like the most handsome woman anywhere. She had not cried. She was proud of that. She had turned away from Thomas Aldrich and walked deliberately to the far end of the yard, the part where the light from the lanterns barely reached, and she had stood there in the near dark with her back straight and her jaw tight, deciding with great care that she would feel none of this until she was home, until she was alone in the small room above the storeroom with the door shut and the candle snuffed. And that was when she heard it, a boot's sole against dry earth. A quiet, deliberate sound, the sound of someone who was trying very hard not to be heard but who was, despite all efforts, still present. She turned. He was sitting on the lowest step of Hadley's Mercantile porch, so still and so tucked into the shadow that she could not understand, even now, how she had failed to see him all evening. He was a tall man, even seated. Long legs stretched out in front of him, boots crossed at the ankle, hat pulled down in the way men pulled their hats when they wanted the world to understand that they were not inviting conversation. He held a cup of something in both hands and was not drinking it, merely holding it, as though the warmth were the only thing he was after. "I did not mean to startle you," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who did not raise it often and did not need to. Marcella stared at him. "How long have you been sitting there?" "Most of the evening," he said, with the faint suggestion that he knew exactly how strange this admission was. She stopped. The embarrassment rose in her so fast it nearly choked her. If he had been there most of the evening, then he had very likely seen all of it. Thomas Aldrich, the 3 dances, the walk to the punch bowl. The moment her face had changed. She felt the heat rush from her collar to her hairline and lifted her chin against it. "Then you have had an entertaining night," she said, with as much dignity as she could assemble. He looked up at her then, pushing the brim of his hat back just far enough that she could see his eyes. They were dark, serious eyes, set in a face that was neither young nor old, weathered and honest in the way that the land itself was honest, giving you exactly what it was and not a thing more. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two beyond, and his expression was not amused. It was something else entirely, something careful and contained that she could not immediately name. "I have not," he said simply. "I am sorry about what happened." The directness of it undid her more than any offered comfort could have. She had expected mockery, or worse, pity dressed up as sympathy. She had not expected the plain and serious acknowledgment of someone who had witnessed an injustice and was naming it without embellishment. She did not know what to say to that. She looked at him for a moment longer and then looked away. "I am Marcella Graves," she said, because it seemed like the only solid thing she had left to offer. "I know who you are," he said. "You drive the Graves supply route. Your father passed in April." "He did." She looked back at him. "And you are—" He paused, as though the question surprised him, though it should not have. "Vernon Hartwell," he said. "I have the ranch northeast of town, the one that runs along Bitter Creek." She thought she should know the name. She searched her memory and found something at the edges of it, something her father had mentioned once in passing, something about the Hartwell land and the family that had owned it before the war and the son who had come back to it afterward alone. But the memory was thin and incomplete, and she could not be certain she had it right. "You came to the social alone," she said. It was not quite a question. "I came because my neighbor, Mrs. Potts, said it would do me good," he said. He looked back down at the cup in his hands. "It has not done me good." Despite herself, despite the wreckage of the evening and the burning humiliation still sitting in her chest, Marcella felt something shift in her. A small, almost involuntary thing, like the turning of a key in a lock she had forgotten existed. She looked at this man sitting alone in the shadow of the porch steps, holding a cold cup of something with both hands, and she recognized in him something she understood with her whole body. He had not wanted to be here either. She walked to the bottom porch step and sat down beside him, not close, a respectable distance, but on the same step. She felt him go very still in the way that prey animals go still, not from fear exactly but from the sudden uncertainty of the moment. "What are you drinking?" she asked. A beat of silence. "Cider," he said. "It went cold an hour ago." "Mine too." She reached down beside her and picked up her own forgotten cup from where she had set it in the dirt. She had not even remembered setting it down. She took a sip of the cold cider and said nothing, and he said nothing, and somewhere out in the dark a nighthawk cut a cry across the sky and was gone. "Did you dance with anyone?" she asked. "No," he said. "Did you try?" Another pause, longer this time. "I stood near the edge of things for a while," he said, "watching people and feeling like a stranger, though I have lived 12 miles from this town for 7 years. The honesty of it was striking. Men in Marcella's experience did not speak this way, plainly and without armor, about the private mechanics of loneliness. It unsettled her. It also, in some way she could not entirely account for, made the tight clenched thing in her chest loosen by the smallest degree. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "If it was not pleasant." He turned his head and looked at her sidelong. In the dim light from the last guttering lantern she could see him more clearly now, the strong line of his jaw, the faint creasing at the corners of his eyes, the way his hands around the cup were large and were roughened and somehow, despite everything, gentle in their grip. He seemed to be deciding something. "I am not entirely sure," he said at last. And from the way he said it, quiet and wondering, she had the sense that this was the most truthful answer he had ever given anyone. They sat together in the cooling October dark for a long time after that, not talking much but not needing to, while the town of Harlow Springs, Kansas, settled into its nighttime quiet around them, and the last lantern gave one final flicker and went out. It was only later, riding home along the dark road with the October stars enormous overhead and the wagon wheels raising small clouds of pale dust behind her, that Marcella Graves understood she had not learned very much at all about Vernon Hartwell, and that somehow, inexplicably, this had been the most genuine conversation she had experienced in months. She did not know what to do with that. She pressed her horse forward and rode home through the dark and tried not to think about it. She thought about it the entire way. Vernon Hartwell had not wanted to attend the Harlow Springs Harvest Social. He had said as much to his horse that morning while tacking her up in the dim of the barn, speaking the words aloud to the spotted gray, mare named Compass, the way a man who lives alone sometimes speaks aloud to the available audience. "I do not know why I said yes," he told Compass, who flicked one ear back and forth in a gesture of either sympathy or indifference. It was impossible to tell with horses. She asked me 3 times, and eventually the answer yes came out of my mouth, and now I am trapped. The she in question was Emmeline Potts, 63 years old, wide as she was tall, with a laugh like a barn door coming off its hinges, and an absolute iron conviction that Vernon Hartwell needed to stop living like a hermit and rejoin the human community before he calcified entirely. She had been of this conviction since she had moved onto the neighboring property 2 years ago, and discovered that her nearest neighbor was a man who bought his supplies in town as quickly as possible and returned home with the focused urgency of someone fleeing a fire. She was not wrong, exactly. Vernon was aware of this. He was aware in the way that a man is aware of a stone in his boot, present and persistent and impossible to ignore, though he had become practiced at limping along without acknowledgement. The thing about Vernon Hartwell was that he had not always been this way. He had grown up in this county, had learned to ride and rope and read the sky on this land, had once been the kind of young man who was easy in company, easy with laughter, comfortable in the world he occupied. That had been before the war. Before he had gone away at 19 and come back at 23 with something fundamental altered, some essential ease of being replaced with a wariness that ran so deep it had become structural, like the grain in wood. He had come back to find his mother 3 years gone, his father not long after, the ranch in considerable debt and considerable disrepair, and no one at all waiting for him on the porch. He had paid the debts by working his own land harder than the land probably deserved, had rebuilt what needed rebuilding and left standing what could stand on its own, and had settled into the life of a man who was reasonably content with solitude, or at least who had made his peace with it so thoroughly that he could no longer tell the difference between contentment and resignation. He had one friend in town, a man named Dolph Crane, who ran the blacksmith shop, and who had the useful quality of not requiring much conversation to maintain the friendship. They would sometimes sit together in the evening when Vernon came in for supplies, drinking coffee in the back of the shop and watching the main street go about its business, and this passed for companionship, and neither man felt the need to name it or examine it more closely. But the social had been a different thing entirely, and he had known it would be. And he had gone anyway because Emmeline Potts had 3 times made the case for it, and because he was 31 years old, and sometimes, very late at night when the prairie wind was making its low sound around the eaves of the house, the thought would arrive that he was going to live and die on this land alone, and the thought did not always sit as comfortably as it once had. He had arrived at the social early and immediately wished he had not. The yard behind Hadley's Mercantile had been filling up with the noise and warmth of people who knew each other and were glad of the knowing, and Vernon had felt himself go inward the way he did in crowds, not angry, not unkind, but sealed, as though some protective mechanism engaged without his consent and put a pane of glass between him and the rest of the world. He had stood near the edge of things for a while, as he had told Marcella Graves later. He had watched the dancing and thought about dancing and rejected the thought and watched the dancing some more. He had gotten a cup of cider and retreated to the porch steps because the porch steps had a shadow and the shadow felt manageable. He had watched the evening proceed around him with the disengaged attention of a man watching weather from a window, close enough to observe but safely removed from getting wet. He had noticed Marcella Graves early, not because she was the most beautiful woman there, though she was certainly striking, tall with dark hair pinned up severely, and eyes that caught the lantern light in a way that suggested they were doing a great deal more seeing than people generally wanted to be seen doing. He had noticed her because she was alone in the same way he was alone, but actively rather than retreating, moving through the social with a confidence that he recognized, after some study, was performed. She was playing a part, the part of the woman who is perfectly comfortable and not thinking about the fact that she has recently lost her father and is now managing a difficult route alone in a county that was still deciding how it felt about a woman doing such things. He had watched her with Thomas Aldrich and had felt, without any right to feel it, a dull and quiet anger. He recognized Thomas Aldrich from town, recognized the type, and had known within 20 minutes of observation that something false was operating there. When he had seen the moment of Aldrich's revelation on her face, the way her expression had moved through surprise to understanding to the careful blankness of a woman who would not give a man the satisfaction of her pain, he had felt the anger sharpen briefly and then settle back to its quiet register. He had not intended to speak to her. He had thought he would simply remain on the steps until she walked away, and then he would get his horse and go home, and that would be the end of it. And then she had turned and looked at him, and everything had gone differently than planned. The road from Vernon's ranch to town ran for 12 miles through open grassland and along the ridge of a low creek bed that filled in spring and ran shallow in fall. He knew every foot of it. He had ridden it in every kind of weather, in the cracked white heat of July and in the February blizzards that came out of the north with the total commitment of a righteous catastrophe. He rode it the morning after the social with the October sun low and golden at his back, the air carrying its first real tooth of cold, and he tried to understand what had happened to him on the porch steps. Something had happened to him on the porch steps. He was not naive enough to think it was what it appeared to be. He was 31 years old, and he was not in the habit of having things happen to him, the specific things that happened between a man and a woman, and he suspected that the combination of the dark and the cold cider and the genuine shock of being spoken to directly had created in him a susceptibility that he should not overinterpret. But he kept returning to the way she had sat down beside him without preamble or performance, not because she liked him or knew him, but because they were, in that moment, the only two people left and the night was cold and the porch steps were solid. He kept returning to the quality of her voice, which was direct and a little husky, and not at all what he had expected from a woman who dressed and moved with that kind of precision. He kept returning to the fact that she had not asked him to make her feel better about Thomas Aldrich, had not required anything from him at all except his honest company, and had offered the same in return without fanfare. He also kept returning to the fact that she ran her father's supply route alone. He knew about the Graves route. Ephraim Graves had built the most reliable dry goods distribution in the county, serving half a dozen ranches and 2 small settlements between Harlow Springs and the Oklahoma border. When Ephraim had died in April, there had been considerable speculation about what would become of the route. Vernon had heard talk at the blacksmith shop, overheard it rather, the way he overheard most things, standing slightly to the side of conversations that didn't quite reach him. People had assumed the route would collapse or be sold. People had underestimated Marcella Graves. She had taken it over. She drove the wagon herself and hired a young man named Caleb for the heavier loading work, and she had kept every account her father had kept and added 2 more. Vernon knew this not because he had sought the information, but because Dolph Crane had told him, with the particular satisfaction of a man relaying a story that vindicates something, that Marcella Graves was as good at the route as her father and perhaps better, because she kept more careful accounts. Vernon's ranch was not on her route. He bought his dry goods in town. He thought about this on the ride home with the focused attention of a man who is thinking about something, without wishing to admit he is thinking about it. A week passed, then 2. November came in cold and gray, the sky taking on the flat pewter quality that presaged winter on the Kansas plains, the light changing to that particular slant that made everything look both cleaner and more austere. Vernon worked his cattle through the early weeks of it, moving the herd to the winter pasture, repairing fence lines, doing the 100 preparations that the land required before the cold settled in for its long stay. He went into town once, on a Tuesday, for flour and coffee, and the kerosene that the winter would consume in quantities that still surprised him every year. He tied his horse in front of the general store, Haggerty's, and went in and gave his list to the boy behind the counter and waited while it was filled. The door opened, and Marcella Graves came in. She was wearing a coat he had not seen at the social, dark wool, practical and plain, and her hair was done less carefully, a few strands escaping at the temples in a way that suggested she had been working since before the sun was up. She had a ledger book tucked under one arm and a look of concentrated purpose on her face that did not immediately accommodate the possibility of other people. Then she saw him. He watched her recognition of him happen across her features in a series of small, rapid adjustments. The slight widening of the eyes, the controlled recalibration, the decision about how to respond to this unexpected variable. He had enough experience watching people from the outside to recognize all of it, even the moment she settled on her choice. "Vernon Hartwell," she said. "Marcella Graves," he said. They stood looking at each other in the middle of Haggerty's general store for a moment that was about 3 seconds long and felt considerably longer. "Cold," she observed. "Coming in faster than last year," he agreed. She nodded once, sharp and decisive, as though this exchange had concluded some negotiation, and moved past him toward the counter. He took his filled order from the boy and paid for it and walked to the door and then stopped, because some part of him, some portion of his usually reliable self-protective instinct, had temporarily gone to sleep. He turned around. "My ranch is northeast along Bitter Creek," he said. "The road connects to the Abilene route at the Jensen Crossing. If you are ever expanding the supply route—" He stopped. He could hear how inadequate this was. He could see in the careful neutrality of her expression that she was hearing it too. He pushed on anyway. "I would be a reliable account." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something working in her expression, some calculation running behind those direct eyes, but he could not read what it was calculating. "The Jensen Crossing Road is in poor condition in winter," she said. "It is," he said. "I would not expect you to drive it in poor conditions." Another moment of looking. Then she opened her ledger book, pulled a pencil from her coat pocket, and said, "What is your usual supply?" "Flour, coffee, kerosene. What else?" he told her. She wrote it down. She wrote his name at the top of the entry, neat and firm, and closed the book and looked up at him. "I pass the Jensen Crossing the first Wednesday of each month," she said. "It is a 14-mile detour from my current route. I will need to account for that in the pricing." "That is fair," he said. She nodded again. "First Wednesday in December," she said, "if the road holds." "The road will hold," he said, though he did not know this for certain, and they both understood that he did not. She put the pencil back in her coat pocket. "Good day, Vernon Hartwell. Good day, Marcella Graves." She turned back to the counter, and he walked out of Haggerty's into the cold November morning and stood by his horse for a moment, breathing the cold air and doing something he had not done in a very long time. He was smiling, not at anyone, just at the cold air and the gray sky and the particular strange arithmetic of how one thing leads to another when you are not paying careful enough attention. He mounted up and rode home, and he was still smiling when he passed the Jensen Crossing, and he thought about what kind of condition the road would be in by December, and he thought that he should probably take the wagon out and look at it, fill in the worst of the ruts before the ground froze. He did exactly that the following Saturday, alone in the cold morning with a shovel and a load of gravel, working the ruts in the Jensen Crossing road until they were flat and solid. It was, he told himself, simply the courteous thing to do for someone who was going to be making a 14-mile detour on his account. It was practical. It was entirely unrelated to anything else. Compass flicked her ear back and forth. "Do not look at me like that," he told her. The first Wednesday of December came with a sky like hammered iron and a wind out of the north that had real intention behind it. Vernon had been up since before first light, had done his morning work in the barn and the pens, and had then come into the house and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table trying to read a week-old newspaper with the focused attention of a man who is absolutely not listening for wagon wheels on the road. He heard them at about 9:30. The specific sound of a loaded supply wagon, the weight of it in the creak of the axle, the particular rhythm of a horse being driven steady rather than fast. He gave it what he considered a reasonable interval before he put on his coat and went out. She pulled the wagon to a stop in front of his gate with the practiced ease of someone who has been handling a rig in tight spaces for years. Beside her on the seat was a young man of maybe 18, broad through the shoulders with a serious face, who Vernon understood must be the hired Caleb. In the bed of the wagon under oilcloth were the crates and sacks of his order. "Road was better than I expected," Marcella said, by way of greeting. She was wearing the dark wool coat again, and had added a wool scarf wrapped twice around her neck against the cold. Her nose was pink from the wind. Her eyes were alert and taking everything in: the state of the gate, the condition of the road surface, the lay of the ranch yard beyond, with the thoroughness of a woman who makes assessments quickly and accurately. "I ran some gravel in the worst spots," Vernon said. "A few weeks back." She looked at him, a pause, small and weighted. "That was considerate," she said, and her tone was not quite flat but not quite warm either, carrying something between the two that he could not precisely identify. He helped Caleb unload. It took about 20 minutes, carrying the crates into the storehouse at the side of the barn, stacking them in the order Caleb indicated with the quiet authority of someone who has a system and requires that system to be respected. While they worked, Marcella stood by the wagon making notes in her ledger, recording the delivery against the order, the same careful accounting her father had apparently taught her. When it was done, Vernon went inside and brought out a tin of coffee he had kept warm on the stove. He offered it to Caleb, who accepted with a nod, and then to Marcella, who accepted it with both hands, the way you accept warmth when you have been cold for hours and your hands ache with it. "How is the route in this weather?" he asked. She wrapped her hands around the tin. "Manageable," she said. "The Hargrove section is the worst. The road dips close to the creek and it ices early. I take it slow." She said it matter-of-factly, without complaint or performance, the simple description of a challenge she had considered and planned for. "Caleb breaks ice when we need to. We have not lost a delivery yet. How many accounts now?" She looked at him with the slight narrowing of someone deciding whether a question is idle curiosity or something else. "9, she said. 10 with yours." "That is a solid business," he said. "My father built a solid business," she said. "I am maintaining it and trying to expand it." She took a sip of the coffee. A moment passed. "People sometimes express surprise that I am managing it. People underestimate things they do not understand," he said. She looked at him over the rim of the tin, and something in her expression shifted very slightly, the set of it softening by the smallest degree. "They do," she said. They stood in the cold yard outside his storehouse and drank their coffee, and he asked her about the routes, and she told him, with the specificity of someone who has thought about logistics in the way that some people think about chess, mapping out the decision-making about timing and road conditions and customer needs. He listened and asked questions that were genuine rather than polite, the kind of questions that emerged from actual interest in the problem, and she answered them with a precision and enthusiasm that told him this was a subject on which she was rarely given the chance to speak fully. When the coffee was finished, she handed back the tin and made to climb up to the wagon seat. He held the horse's bridle while she got up, an old reflex of courtesy, and she said "thank you" without looking at him, pulling her scarf tighter and gathering the reins. Caleb climbed up beside her and she clucked to the horse, and the wagon began to turn in the yard. "First Wednesday in January," she said, without looking back, as the wagon found the gate opening and went through. "First Wednesday in January," he confirmed. He stood at his gate and watched the wagon until it was out of sight around the bend in the creek road, and then he stood there a moment longer, looking at the empty road with his hands in his coat pockets and the cold wind pressing against his face, and felt, with a clarity that was both welcome and frightening, that something was happening that he had not planned for and did not know how to stop, and was not at all certain he wanted to. January was hard. The blizzards came in waves, 2 days of freeze and white followed by a brief relent, and then another wave. The kind of winter the old-timers described as punishing, with the fond satisfaction of people who have survived punishing things and want credit for it. Vernon lost 3 head of cattle to a cold snap in the second week, and spent 3 days breaking ice on the water troughs and hauling hay to where the herd had bunched against the windbreak, coming inside each evening so cold he could barely work the buttons on his coat. He wondered if the January delivery would happen. The road from town to the Jensen crossing was not long, but it ran exposed, no tree cover, and in a real blizzard it was impassable. He told himself he was thinking about this from a practical standpoint in terms of supply. He needed the flour, the coffee. The first Wednesday of January brought a clear morning after 4 days of snow, the world outside his windows blindingly white and still, the cold so dry it made the air crackle. He did his morning chores and came in and made coffee, and did not sit at the kitchen table trying to read a newspaper. He sat there quite openly watching the window. The wagon appeared at 10:30. She was alone. He was outside before she had fully pulled to a stop. "Where is Caleb?" he asked. "His mother is ill," she said. "He is needed at home." She was already climbing down from the seat, moving to the back of the wagon and pulling back the oilcloth. "I managed perfectly well on my own before Caleb," she said, in the tone of someone who knows a protest is coming and is preemptively closing that avenue. He did not protest. He helped her unload, and she directed the placement of each crate with the same system Caleb had, and they worked in silence that was comfortable rather than awkward, each person efficient in the work, and it took about the same 20 minutes. When it was done and they were standing in the yard again with coffee, he said, "That road was slick this morning, from the creek bend to the crossing." "I know," she said. "I came through it slowly. The horse is steady. You should not be driving that route alone in these conditions." She turned to look at him directly. "I beg your pardon." He recognized his mistake and tried to repair it. "I meant the road, not your ability." "The road is the road," she said. "I have been driving it since I was 16 next to my father. I know its conditions." "I do not doubt that," he said carefully. "I am saying that a person alone in a stuck wagon on an iced road 12 miles from town in January is in genuine danger regardless of their skill, because skill does not help when something goes wrong, and there is no one to go for help." She held his gaze for a moment longer, the challenge in her eyes testing whether this was genuine concern or something else, some version of the doubt she had heard from 100 other people, the doubt dressed up in worry's clothing. Whatever she found in his expression, she appeared to accept it. "I will be careful," she said. "I know you will," he said. "I am saying that careful sometimes needs a contingency." The corner of her mouth moved slightly. It was not quite a smile, but it contained the possibility of one. "And what is your proposed contingency, Vernon Hartwell?" He had not thought this through as far as she had apparently assumed. He said after a moment, "I could ride out to meet you at the crossing. On bad days, make sure you get through." The possibility of a smile receded, replaced by something more complex, more careful. She looked out over the white fields for a moment and then back at him. "That is a significant offer," she said. "It is a practical one," he said. "Is it?" It was not a question. He did not answer it as one. She finished her coffee and gave him back the tin and climbed up to the wagon with the spare efficiency of someone who has been getting in and out of wagon seats in all weather conditions for a decade. She gathered her reins and looked down at him. "You would have to be at the crossing by 9 in the morning," she said. "I leave town at 7. "I can be at the crossing by 9, he said. "In bad weather only," she said. "In bad weather only," he agreed. She nodded once and drove away, and this time when he stood at his gate watching her go, he was not confused about what was happening. He was only unsure of what to do with the understanding. He did not have to wait long to test the arrangement. The following Wednesday was not a scheduled delivery day, but 2 days after that a storm came in that would have been impassable on the exposed Jensen Crossing Road. And though Marcella was not scheduled to drive that route, he thought about her on the other routes, on the Hargrove section near the iced creek, and felt the anxiety of it as a physical thing sitting in his chest. He could not ride to her aid on routes he had no reason to know she was taking. He was aware of this. He was also aware that this awareness was its own kind of information. February brought a brief warming, the fall spring that sometimes visited Kansas in the final weeks of the month, when the light changed and the days stretched, and the land gave the misleading impression that the worst was over. Marcella arrived on the first Wednesday in a coat she did not need to button, and with her hair escaping somewhat more energetically from its pins, the warmth bringing out a looseness in her that the cold months had kept contained. They unloaded together with a speed and ease that reflected the practice of two people who had now done this task 3 times and knew each other's rhythms, without needing to discuss them. Afterward they sat on the low fence outside the storehouse because the sun was genuinely warm and the coffee was good, and Caleb, who had returned the previous month, went to look at the horse's left rear shoe which had been worrying Marcella. "I am going to expand to 2 more accounts by March," she said. "The Tillman Ranch and the new settlement at Cross Creek. That adds at least 30 miles to the route," he said. 28, she said. "I have already mapped it." He looked at her. She was sitting with her face turned toward the winter sun, eyes half closed in a way that was unself-conscious and lovely, and he was looking at her with an attention he was not being careful enough about. "You will need a second wagon," he said. "I know," she said. She did not open her eyes. "I am working on that." A pause. "There is a man in Abilene who is selling a used Studebaker freight wagon in good condition. I have written to him. You need a second driver as well. I have been thinking about asking Mrs. Hargrove's oldest son. He is 17 and capable with horses, and he needs work." She opened her eyes and looked sideways at him. "I know you are going to say 17 is young." "I was not going to say that," he said, which was true. He had been going to say that 17 was perfectly reasonable for a driver if the young man was capable, and she seemed to have already assessed the capability. "I was going to say that if you are managing 2 routes simultaneously, you need reliable communication between them, a system for knowing if something goes wrong on either end." She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was genuinely thinking about this rather than waiting for the conversation to end. "What sort of system?" she asked. And that was how Vernon Hartwell came to spend the next hour sitting on a fence rail in the February sunshine, working through logistics with a woman who thought about distribution, routes the way he thought about land management, systematically, and with the long view, both of them talking and revising and arguing mildly about specific details. And it was the best hour he had spent in a very long time. When Caleb called that the shoe was fine, just loose, and came back around to let them know, he found his employer and the rancher deep in a conversation about relay messaging, specifically whether it was better to designate fixed checkpoints or to use the livery boy in town as a central relay. He stopped at a respectful distance and waited for a natural break, which took a while to arrive. Marcella looked up and saw Caleb waiting and registered with visible surprise that considerably more time had passed than she had accounted for. She stood up from the fence and tucked her ledger under her arm and became the efficient businesswoman again, the woman who had a route to finish and 3 more deliveries today. But as she was climbing to the wagon seat, she paused and looked down at him with an expression that was not quite contained. "You have a good mind for this," she said. "The root problems. You built a system worth thinking about," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and in that moment something was visible between them that both of them had been carefully not naming, something present and specific and neither small nor manageable. She looked away first. "First Wednesday in March," she said. "I will be here," he said. "You had better be," she said, lightly enough that it could have been a joke, but the laughter that followed it was slightly unsteady in a way that suggested it was not entirely a joke, and they both knew it, and she drove away quickly after. March came in with the genuine warmth of a spring beginning to mean it, the grass showing green at the roots of the old brown, the creek running full with snowmelt, the sky taking back its depth of blue after the flat gray months. Vernon's land looked different in March, came alive in ways that always surprised him after winter had made it look like everything was over. He thought about this as he drove his own wagon to the Jensen Crossing Road on the first Wednesday, carrying a proposal. He had been working on the proposal for 3 weeks. He had written it out twice, on actual paper with ink, and then burned both drafts because they were either too formal or not formal enough, and he was not certain what the right register was for this kind of thing. In the end, he had decided to say it plainly, because plain was what he had, and because she was, above all things, a person who preferred plain to decorated. She arrived at 9.5 minutes past 9, Caleb beside her, the wagon riding heavy with a full load. The morning was bright and cold crisp in the way of early spring mornings, and Marcella had color in her face from the air, and was talking to Caleb about something that made her laugh as they came around the creek bend. A real laugh, not the performed kind, open and unguarded. He stood by his horse at the crossing and watched her laugh and felt something in his chest that had been cautious for a very long time take a definitive step forward. They unloaded. They had the rhythm of it completely now, working like people who have built something together through repetition and do not need words for most of it. When it was done and Caleb went to water the horse and they were standing in the yard, she said, "You drove out to the crossing. It is not a bad weather day." "No," he said. "I wanted to ask you something." She looked at him with those seeing eyes. "Harlow Springs is having a spring dance in 2 weeks," he said. "The last Saturday of March. I would like to take you if you are willing to go with me." The silence that followed was not long, but it was complete, the particular fullness of a moment that contains too much to be brief. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, not the careful neutral she showed most people, and not the concentrated working face she had for logistics. This was something open and a little undefended, a face that was deciding in real time. "You do not like socials," she said. "I do not like them without a reason to be there," he said. Something moved through her expression. She looked away briefly, out over the spring fields where the new grass was lifting itself from the brown earth, and then back at him. Her chin was at its characteristic angle, direct and held steady. "I will need to be home by 10, she said. "I have deliveries Thursday morning." "I will have you home by 10, he said. "I will not need you to hold my hand when we walk to the punch bowl," she said, and there was heat in it, a warning about the territory, about what this was and what it was not yet allowed to be. "I would not presume," he said, and he meant it, though the way he said it also contained the information that he would, in the right circumstances, very much like to. She heard all of it. He could see her hear it. "All right," she said. "The last Saturday of March." "The last Saturday of March," he agreed. The spring dance was everything the Harvest Social had not been, or perhaps it was the same and they were different. The same Hadley's yard, the same fiddle player, the same long tables and punch bowl and lanterns strung between posts. But Marcella arrived in a dress the color of deep water, blue-green and utterly, unlike the practical dark wool she wore on the route, and she had done something different with her hair, softer, with a small arrangement of dried flowers at the back that was both simple and unexpectedly beautiful. Vernon wore his good coat and had trimmed his beard that morning, and stood at the gate of Hadley's yard watching for her with the steady tension of a man who has committed to something, and is now reckoning with the full weight of the commitment. She came walking up the road from the direction of her family's house, alone, having declined his offer to collect her because she valued, she had said, the independence of her own 2 feet. He had accepted this. He was coming to understand which of her boundaries were negotiable and which were not, and this one, the independence of her own 2 feet, was not. He fell into step beside her at the gate. "You look very well," he said. "So do you," she said, and they looked at each other briefly in the lamplight from the gate post, and something moved through both of them quickly and silently, like a current. They went in together. Vernon had braced himself for the experience of being inside the crowd, for the glass to come down between himself and everything else, for the retreat instinct to engage. But a strange thing happened. With Marcella beside him, the crowd was navigable. She moved through it with her particular confidence, speaking briefly to people she knew, not lingering, not performing, and he moved alongside her, and the crowd parted around them both, and he was not behind glass. They danced twice. He was not a natural dancer, had never been, but he knew the steps well enough, and she was a strong lead in the sense of knowing what she was doing and adjusting for whatever her partner gave her. And the second dance was considerably better than the first. The second dance she was closer, close enough that he could smell the clean soap of her hair and feel the warmth of her hand in his, and he was so focused on not pulling her closer that he stepped wrong twice. She noticed. She did not say anything. She adjusted. Between dances they stood together and talked to people, and he noticed that when she introduced him she said, "Vernon Hartwell from the Bitter Creek Ranch," with a directness that was neither distancing nor possessive but something quietly confident, the introduction of a person she knew and was comfortable knowing. He stored this away. Thomas Aldrich was there. Of course he was there. It was a small town and he lived in it. He came across them near the punch bowl, and Vernon felt Marcella go slightly very still beside him, not visibly, but he was close enough and attentive enough to perceive it. Aldrich nodded at her with the vague discomfort of a man who knows he has behaved badly and cannot quite manage his own face about it. "Marcella," he said. "Thomas," she said, pleasant and clean, giving him nothing. He looked at Vernon. "Hartwell," another nod. "Aldrich," Vernon said. Aldrich moved on. Marcella reached for the punch bowl and ladled herself a cup with a slightly more forceful motion than strictly necessary, and Vernon said nothing and got his own cup, and they stood companionably by the punch bowl for a moment in silence. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I did not do anything," he said. "You were there," she said. He thought about this for a moment and decided it was enough. Being there, solid and present and undemanding, was a thing he could offer reliably, and she had recognized it, and this seemed to him like the beginning of something that was built on ground that would hold. They stayed until 9:30, at which point Marcella announced that she needed to go. He walked her home, the same direction as his horse, and they walked along the main street of Harlow Springs in the spring night with the stars enormous overhead and the smell of new grass on the air, and talked about everything and nothing, the Cross Creek expansion, and whether the Tillman account was going to come through, and the condition of the road along the creek now that the snowmelt was running. At her gate, which was the gate of the house attached to the storeroom and the small office where she ran her accounts, she stopped and turned to him. "I had a good evening," she said. "So did I," he said. And then, because he was 31 years old and not a man given to indirect speech, he said, "I would like to do this again. Not just a dance. In whatever form seems right to you." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight from her porch, a single lantern she left burning when she went out, made the planes of her face warm and clear. He could see the consideration working in her, not reluctance exactly, but the careful weighing of a woman who has been hurt by carelessness before and does not intend to be hurt by it again. "What form are you suggesting?" she asked. "Any form that doesn't require you to compromise your route or your business," he said. "I am on your route now. I will be here on the first Wednesday of every month. That is already a form." The corner of her mouth lifted. "You added yourself to my route to have a form," she said. "I added myself to your route because I need flour and coffee," he said. "The form was a benefit I discovered afterward." She laughed, and the laugh was the real one, the unguarded one he had heard from the wagon seat as they came around the creek bend, and hearing it was the best thing that had happened to him in years, possibly longer. "Good night, Vernon Hartwell," she said. "Good night, Marcella Graves," he said. He walked to his horse and rode home through the spring night with the stars wheeling overhead and the land breathing its new season smell all around him, and he felt, with a certainty he had not felt about anything in a very long time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The spring expanded into summer, and the summer was generous, rains arriving at sensible intervals, the grass deep and thick, the cattle doing well, the land expressing the particular satisfaction of a year that was going right. Vernon worked hard and the work was good, satisfying in the way that physical work in service of something you have built with your own hands is always satisfying, and the satisfaction was not less for now being accompanied by a private brightness that sat underneath everything else and made the whole season feel different in quality. He saw Marcella on the first Wednesday of every month, which was the delivery day. But he also saw her in town on Tuesdays when she ran accounts, and occasionally on a Saturday afternoon she would drive her smaller wagon out the Jensen Crossing Road on the pretext of checking road conditions, and he would happen to be working the fence line near the road, and they would stop and talk for an hour that somehow never felt like an hour, leaning against the fence or sitting on the lowered wagon tailgate in the sun, while the horses stood philosophically in their traces. He learned things about her that he filed carefully. He learned that she had not always planned to stay in Kansas, that she had thought, at 18 and 19, about going east to study what she did not say and he did not press. But there had been something specific she had wanted, and the money had not been there. He learned that she had been engaged once briefly, at 21, to a man named Prescott who had gone west to California and had written twice and then not written. He learned that she had been running the route informally since she was 17, accompanying her father and learning the business, and that the accounting system she used was entirely her own design, not inherited. He told her things in return, also carefully. He told her about the war, not the details of it but the shape of what it had done to him, the way it had made crowds difficult and noise sometimes unbearable and solitude not a choice but a necessity. He told her about coming home to an empty house and a land that needed everything and the years of putting it back together alone. He told her about the satisfaction of this, the way a man who has built something alone knows its value precisely because he knows every piece of the labor. She listened to all of it with the full attention she gave to everything, not filling his silences with reassurance or sympathy, but hearing what was being said and sitting with it honestly. It was the quality of her listening as much as her speaking that made him feel, progressively over these months, that he had found something rare. In June, he kissed her. It happened at the fence line on a Saturday afternoon when the conversation had moved through several topics and arrived at a pause, the kind of pause that was not empty but full, and she was looking at him with the expression she sometimes wore that was partly what he thought of as the working face, assessing and considering, and partly something else that her control was not quite containing, and he thought, "I am 31 years old and I have been afraid of things for a long time, and she is worth the risk." He reached out and touched her face with one hand, just the edge of his palm along her jaw, a question in the gesture. She answered it by not moving away. So he kissed her briefly and carefully and pulled back to look at her. She looked back at him. Her composure had shifted by several degrees from its usual setting. "Well," she said after a moment. "I hope that was all right," he said. "It was," she said. "Do it again." He did. They stood by the fence for a while after that, not talking, both looking out over his fields with her shoulder against his arm, and his hand not quite holding hers but resting alongside it on the fence rail. And the summer prairie was golden around them, and the sky was enormous and blue, and somewhere down the creek, a red-tailed hawk was riding the thermals in long, slow circles. "I'm not going to be a conventional sort of wife," she said out of nowhere in the tone of someone putting information clearly on the table. "If this goes that direction." He looked at her. "Did I ask you to be?" "Most men eventually do," she said. There was no bitterness in it, just the plain experience of someone who has learned something through observation and data. "I am not most men," he said. It was not arrogant the way he said it. It was simply true, and she knew it was true, and that was the end of that particular concern. She turned and looked at him directly. "The route stays mine," she said. "The business stays mine." "Agreed," he said. "I would not want it otherwise." "It is a good business. You built it well." Something softened in her then, a softening that went deeper than the surface. She turned back to the fields and leaned her shoulder more firmly against his arm, a small thing but deliberate, an acceptance. "I like you very much, Vernon Hartwell," she said. "I like you very much, Marcella Graves," he said. They stayed at the fence until the sun dropped to the horizon line, and the air went gold. And then she drove back to town, and he walked back up to the house and made supper and ate it alone, as he had done for 7 years, and it did not feel the same as it had the night before. Autumn returned, and with it the particular quality of light that had been hanging over that first evening at the Harvest Social, the October amber and the dry grass smell, and Marcella drove the first Wednesday delivery with Caleb, and the new second wagon was now operational, driven by young Benjamin Hargrove, who had proven himself reliable over the summer months. The expanded route was holding. The Tillman account had come through. The Cross Creek settlement had added 2 more. She told him all of this as they unloaded and stacked, and he could hear the satisfaction in her voice, the deep, genuine pride of a person whose work is paying out the way she calculated it would, and he felt proud of her in a way that was simple and clean and had nothing complicated in it. After Caleb and the wagon had gone, she stayed. She stayed because it was a fine afternoon, and they walked out to the creek and sat on the bank where the cottonwoods were going gold, the leaves dropping one at a time, with the leisurely confidence of things that have done this before and know the sequence. She took off her boots and put her feet in the water and made a sharp sound at the cold and then kept them there, because she was the kind of woman who once committed to something, stayed committed. He sat beside her and watched the creek and was deeply, quietly happy in a way that was not dramatic or performed but was entirely real, the kind of happiness that feels like solid ground. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About whether I want to stay in the house attached to the storeroom for the rest of my life," she said. She was looking at the creek, not at him. "It was my father's house. It is practical. It is where the office is. But it is small and it smells like the storeroom, and I have been in it since I was 4 years old." He waited. "I have also been thinking," she continued, still looking at the creek, "about this land, along the creek here, the way the cottonwoods look in October." She stopped and finally looked at him sideways from under the brim of her hat. "I have been thinking about it in a specific way." He looked back at her. "In what specific way?" he asked, though he had an exact and complete understanding of what specific way. She held his gaze. "In the way of someone who is deciding whether she wants to build something in a particular place," she said, "with a particular person." He reached over and took her hand, the one that was resting on the grass between them. He held it carefully, her capable hand, the one that handled reins and ledger pages and loaded crates, and he held it as though it were something worth holding carefully, which it was. "I would very much like that," he said. She looked at their joined hands and then back at the creek. "The office would have to come here," she said. "Or we build a separate office at the edge of your property near the road so I can receive accounts without driving to town every time. We build the office," he said, "wherever you need it, and I keep the storeroom in town for inventory. Caleb can manage the in-town receiving." "Caleb is capable of that," he said. "He is," she said. "I have been training him for it." A pause. "I have been planning this for a while." "I know," he said. She turned to look at him fully. "You knew." "I watch you think," he said. "I recognize the planning face." She looked at him for a moment and then laughed and turned back to the creek, and the afternoon light came through the cottonwood leaves and lay in pieces on the water, gold and moving, and they sat on the bank with their hands together while the autumn built itself slowly around them. He asked her to marry him properly on the first Wednesday in November, not at the fence line. He had thought carefully about where and decided that the storehouse yard where they had first really talked, where she had first stayed for coffee and they had first worked out the logistics of the route in the winter cold, was the right place. It was their place, built through repetition and work, and it was appropriate. He had a ring. He had gone to Abilene in October, a 2-day ride, specifically to find a ring that was not fussy but was good. and had come back with a simple gold band set with a small dark stone that he thought suited her, and he had lived with it in his coat pocket for 3 weeks. She was in the middle of checking her ledger against the delivered inventory when he said her name with the specific quality of voice that meant something was about to be different. She looked up. He was standing in front of her holding the ring. He said the words plainly and directly, without the excess of decoration, because it was Marcella Graves and she valued the plain and direct. And he told her that he loved her and that he wanted to spend his life working alongside her and watching her build the things she was building, and that he would not presume to alter any of what she had made of herself and her life, but that he wanted to be part of it, permanently, if she would have him. She looked at him for a very long time. Her ledger was still open in her hand. She closed it. "Yes," she said. The word was not tentative. It was precise, deliberate, and entirely committed, the way she said everything she meant. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment and then looked up at him, and what was in her face was not the contained, controlled expression she wore for the world. It was open. It was everything she had been holding carefully and not naming for months, all of it visible at once, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He put his arms around her and she put her head against his shoulder, and they stood in the storehouse yard in the November cold for a long time, not moving, while Caleb made himself very busy at the far end of the yard and studiously looked at everything except the two of them. They were married in December, on a Saturday that was cold and clear and glittering with frost, in the small church on the north end of Harlow Springs. The wedding was not large. Emmeline Potts was there, and wept with the comprehensive enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for this outcome for 2 years, and felt entirely vindicated. Dolph Crane came and shook Vernon's hand with a force that suggested profound approval. Caleb was there, and Benjamin Hargrove, and the Tillman family who had become, through the account relationship, something close to friends. About 30 people in total, the small constellation of connections that Marcella and Vernon had each separately accumulated, and now, on this day, combined. The minister spoke briefly and clearly in the way that both of them appreciated. When he reached the words that were the point, the central declaration of the whole occasion, and asked Vernon if he took Marcella Graves to be his wife, Vernon looked at her with the full attention he had given her since that October night on the porch steps and said, "I do," with a certainty that moved through the small church like a sound. She said her own words in that direct, certain voice that he loved, and when it was done and they were permitted to acknowledge what had just become real, he kissed her, and she kissed him back with the unfussy certainty of someone who has decided what she wants and intends to have it. Emmeline Potts's laugh, vast and door-hinge resonant, filled the church. They spent the winter settling into the combined life. The ranch house expanded, a new room added on the south side by Vernon's own labor with Caleb's help and Dolph Crane's expert contribution on the ironwork. The office was built near the road as planned, a small sturdy building that smelled of new lumber and housed Marcella's accounts and her correspondence and the scheduling system she had developed, which was now, with the root at 11 accounts and growing, complex enough to require its own dedicated space. The two of them fell into the rhythms of a shared life with the ease that comes from two people who have spent a year learning each other's habits before making any formal commitments. He rose early, and she rose early. He made coffee, and she made the account schedule for the day. He came in from the morning barn work, and she was often already at the office desk by the window, the lamp burning in the dark morning, the scratch of her pen audible through the thin wall between the kitchen and the office she had insisted be connected to the house. He would knock on the connecting door and open it and set her coffee on the desk beside her without interrupting, and she would reach for it without looking up from the page, and he would go back to the kitchen, and this small sequence, performed without comment in the early dark of winter mornings, was the most intimate thing he had experienced in his life. The spring of 1879 came, and the route now had 13 accounts. Marcella hired a third driver, an older woman named Ruth Pelham who had been widowed the previous year and needed work, and who turned out to have a gift for horses and a memory for account details that impressed even Marcella. The network was becoming something significant, a genuine small business of the kind that the county had not seen managed by a woman before and was slowly, with the specific slowness of frontier communities confronting the unexpected, coming to accept. There were still people who expressed surprise at a woman running such an operation. There were still men who directed their questions to Vernon when Marcella was standing right there with the ledger in her hand. Vernon had developed a habit of turning very slightly, just the angle of his body, so that the direction of his attention made perfectly clear who the person in the conversation with actual authority was. He had never had to say anything. The redirect was entirely physical, and Marcella had noticed it the third time it happened, and had said nothing but had looked at him with an expression that told him she had understood and filed it. In the summer she was expecting a child. She told him in July, on a Sunday morning when neither of them was working, and they were sitting on the porch in the early sun with their coffee, watching the land do its July business of being extravagantly alive. She said it in the same direct way she said everything, without preamble, stating the fact and then watching his face. His face had not been complicated to read on this occasion. He had put down his cup and taken both her hands and looked at her with an expression that was not words and did not need to be, and she had squeezed his hands and said, "I know," which was the right answer. The autumn was prosperous and warm, and Marcella continued to run the office and coordinate the route through September and into October, directing operations from the desk when she was not comfortable on the wagon and doing occasional rides in the lighter buggy when she was. She was not interested in being managed about this, and Vernon had learned the precise quality of her independence by now and navigated it with the skill he had developed over the preceding year, expressing genuine concern when it was genuine and genuine confidence in her judgment when that was warranted, which was most of the time. Their son was born in late November, the week before the first snowfall of the season. The doctor from Harlow Springs attended, and Emmeline Potts was there, and the birth was difficult in the way that births are frequently difficult and utterly terrifying for the person standing outside the room, which was where Vernon stood for several hours with the compressed stillness of a man containing something very large. When Emmeline opened the door and told him he could come in, he went in and found Marcella tired and clear-eyed and holding a small, furious person in the crook of her arm, a person who was red-faced and vehement in his objections to recent events, and who was, despite all of this, obviously and completely perfect. "A boy," Vernon said, which was redundant and was the best he could do in the moment. "A boy," Marcella confirmed. She looked up at him, and even in the exhaustion of it her eyes were warm and direct and entirely present. "Come and look at your son." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy, who was calming now, settling from his initial outrage into a more considered assessment of the situation, eyes dark and unfocused and searching. Vernon put one finger against the small closed fist, and the hand opened and closed around it with a grip that was absurdly strong for its size. Something happened in Vernon's chest, something enormous and uncomplicated, with no darkness in it at all. "What do we name him?" Marcella asked. He had thought about this. "Ephraim," he said, "for your father." She looked at him, and what happened in her face was the open thing again, the unguarded fullness that he had first seen at their engagement, and that appeared at the particular moments when something reached past her careful exterior to the person she was underneath it. "Ephraim Hartwell," she said, trying the name. "Ephraim Graves Hartwell," he said. "Both." She looked at the baby, who had now settled into a deep and thoroughly untroubled sleep despite having arrived in a world that was evidently not to his initial specifications. "Ephraim Graves Hartwell," she said softly. "Yes." Vernon stayed beside her on the edge of the bed while the morning built itself outside the window, the winter sun arriving pale and clear over the white fields, the cottonwoods along the creek bare and precise against the sky. He was holding her hand, the ring hand, the hand that handled reins and ledger pages, and the baby slept between them. He thought about the Harvest Social 2 years ago. The reluctance with which he had ridden into town that evening, the sense of being sealed behind glass, the porch steps and the shadow and the cold cup of cider, and the certainty that this was not his kind of evening and he should not have come. He thought about the moment she had turned and seen him. The moment her dignity had reassembled itself and she had sat down beside him on the steps and said, without decoration, "What are you drinking?" He thought about everything between that moment and this one, the long, careful accumulation of it, the first Wednesday mornings and the fence line and the creek bank in October and the ring in Abilene and the clear winter morning of the wedding and the summer porch and the July hands and this. His wife beside him in the winter light, their son sleeping. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. She had always been able to tell when he was thinking. "October," he said. 2 years ago." She was quiet for a moment. "The social," she said. "You did not notice me for hours," he said. She turned her head and looked at him, and he saw the smile start at the corner of her mouth. "You were hiding behind a shadow on a porch step," she said. "I was not specifically looking for hidden men." "I was not hiding," he said. "I was being unobtrusive." "You were hiding," she said with affectionate certainty. "You were the most hidden man at that social." "The most reluctant," he offered. "Both," she said. She looked at him steadily, the directness he had loved since the first moment of it, seeing all of him clearly and without the distortion of either idealization or judgment. "I am glad you were still there when I finally looked." He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed it, the ring and the knuckles and the calloused strength of her fingers. "I was always going to be there," he said. "I just did not know yet who I was staying for." Ephraim Graves Hartwell slept between them with the total confidence of someone who has arrived at exactly the right place. Outside, the winter light lay across the land, across the fields and the creek and the cottonwood row and the storehouse, and the new office with its window facing the road, across everything that two people had built together in 2 years from a chance beginning on a porch step at the end of an evening. By the time Ephraim was walking, the Graves-Hartwell supply route had grown to 17 accounts. Ruth Pelham ran the southern section with a competence that had become legendary in the county. Caleb had been made a full partner in the operations management side, a fact he had responded to with the stunned gravity of a young man who did not quite believe the information. Benjamin Hargrove had saved enough from 2 years of driving to buy his own horse, and had announced plans to start a competing route, at which Marcella had expressed complete and genuine support, and had given him a letter of introduction to 3 potential accounts who were beyond her range. Vernon had watched this with the particular pride of a man watching his wife do something thoroughly characteristic. The ranch was thriving. The cattle herd was the largest it had been since before the war. Vernon had expanded the winter pasture and put in a proper irrigation channel off the creek for the kitchen garden, which produced enough in summer to supply the house through the winter with careful preservation. He had also, over the past year, started growing grain in the south field, a modest operation but sound, and Marcella had suggested in passing that the grain might be added to the supply route's inventory if the yield held, which was exactly the kind of thinking that was, he had long since accepted, her permanent mode of operation. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1881. Vivienne Ruth Hartwell, named for no one specifically and for Ruth Pelham specifically, a name that Marcella had chosen with the decisiveness of someone who had been thinking about it for 9 months and had landed on the exact right answer. Vivienne was, from the first hours of her life, a different kind of person from her brother, less vehement in her initial objections, and more inclined to regard the world with a watchful, considering attention that reminded Vernon, with a jolt of recognition, of her mother. Ephraim, who was a 1.5 years and deeply invested in his own centrality to all events, regarded his sister with a complex mixture of suspicion and proprietary pride that was, his parents agreed privately, going to be the dominant theme of the next decade. The year that Vivienne turned 2 and Ephraim turned 4, Thomas Aldrich left Harlow Springs. He and his wife, the Margaret Colton of Abilene, had not managed things well, and the farm they had bought east of town had gone under in the dry summer, and they left for somewhere east, taking their losses with them. Vernon heard about it from Dolph Crane on a Tuesday in town and said nothing more than a brief acknowledgement, because it was not his business and he did not need to make it so. But that evening at supper, Marcella mentioned it herself, having heard from someone in town, and looked at him across the table where Ephraim was determinedly attempting to manage his own spoon, and Vivienne was asleep in the bassinet near the stove, and said, "I was never in love with him." "I know," he said. "I was lonely and he was attentive, and I was foolish enough to believe the attention was the same thing as something genuine." She said it plainly, without self-pity. "I was wrong about that." "You were not foolish," he said. "You were 26 years old and you trusted what you saw, and what you saw was not what it was." She looked at him across the supper table in the warm lamplight. "I am not in the least sorry it happened," she said, "because of where it ended, on the porch step." Ephraim succeeded with the spoon to his own enormous satisfaction, and both his parents acknowledged this triumph with the gravity it deserved, and the evening settled into its ordinary warmth and bustle, and somewhere out across the land, the late summer dark was coming in over the fields with the smell of cut grass on it, and the creek was running, and the cottonwoods along the bank were making their quiet sound in the night breeze. Vernon sat at the table in the lamplight with his children and his wife and the life they had built together on this land that had been empty and cold and needing everything when he had come back to it from the war a decade ago, and felt the fullness of what occupied it now, the evidence that the soil of a life could be turned and worked and brought back from its depletion if you were patient enough and willing enough and, sometimes, lucky enough to be sitting in the right shadow on the right porch step when someone finally looked. He was not, he had decided, the reluctant kind of man he had once been. Or rather, the reluctance was still in him, the preference for solitude, the glass that sometimes came down between him and crowds, but it was no longer the whole of him. Marcella had not removed it or healed it in some dramatic fashion. She had simply built something beside it that was larger, and the thing she had built was their life, and it was larger than his reluctance, and so the reluctance was not the dominant fact anymore. It was just one thing among many. Among the coffee at dawn, and the ledger pages and the fence-lined conversations, and the creek bank in October, and the Christmas mornings, now 2 years old and growing. Among Ephraim's spoon triumphs and Vivienne's watchful considering gaze and Emmeline Potts's laugh filling the house on Sunday dinners and Dolph Crane's handshake at the gate when he drove out to help with the fence repairs, and all the ordinary extraordinary accumulation of a life that is genuinely shared. He had been the most reluctant man at that social. He had pressed himself to the edge of things and pulled his hat low and told his horse that he should not have come, that this was not his kind of evening, that nothing good would come of it. He had been wrong about all of that. And the most significant fact about being wrong, the fact that he returned to sometimes on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and Marcella was at her desk in the lamplight, and the land was doing its nighttime settling around the house, was how narrowly it had not happened. How very close he had come to leaving before she turned around. How easily he might have gotten his horse at 8:30 and ridden home in the dark and never known the shape of what he had walked away from. He did not think about this with fear, not anymore. He thought about it with the quiet gratitude of a man who had been given something he had not known to ask for and had been wise enough, or lucky enough, to stay. In the spring of 1883, the route crossed into the Oklahoma Territory with a new account at the Cimarron settlement, a significant expansion that required Marcella to negotiate the territorial licensing with a bureaucratic thoroughness that consumed 3 months of correspondence and 2 trips to Wichita. Vernon accompanied her on both trips because she asked him to, which she did not always do, reserving certain things as her own domain. So the asking was significant and he understood it as such. They stayed in a hotel in Wichita on the second trip without the children, who were in Emmeline Potts's cheerful and comprehensive care for 4 days, and walked along the city streets in the evening after the meetings and ate supper at a proper restaurant, and talked about everything that was not immediately urgent, the way people talk when they have been busy for a long time and are briefly not, ranging freely through things they had been meaning to say and questions that had been waiting for the space to be asked. He told her, in the hotel restaurant over good coffee, something he had never quite found the words for before. He told her that she had, without any intention of doing so, given him back something he had thought the war had taken permanently. Not the ease of crowds. He was still not easy in crowds, but something else, the sense of having weight in the world, of being solidly and deliberately present in his own life, rather than observing it from a slight remove. She had made him want to be present. That was what she had done. She looked at him across the table and he saw the thing happen in her face again, the open, unguarded fullness. "I did not do that," she said. "You did that, I was just there." "You were just there," he agreed. "The way you were just there on the porch steps, just staying." She reached across the table and took his hand. "We stayed," she said. "Both of us." He held her hand in the lamplight of the Wichita restaurant and thought that this was the truest version of the story, stripped to its essential element. Two reluctant people, in different ways and for different reasons reluctant, who had stayed when they might have left, who had remained when it would have been easier to go, and in staying had found each other and built from that finding a life that was larger and more solid and more genuinely good than either of them had managed alone. The Cimarron account came through. The route was now the most comprehensive supply network in the region. Marcella's name was known in every county between Harlow Springs and the territory border, known with respect, the particular respect reserved for people who have done something real and built something that holds. Vernon's ranch was the anchor of it. The Bitter Creek property, with its south-facing fields and its water rights and its sound fences and its improving herd, was the base from which the whole operation ran, the office at the road end, and the storehouse at the yard, and the house between them where the family lived and the family was growing, and the evenings were warm and noisy and entirely different from the evenings that had been quiet and cold and his alone. He would not have it otherwise. On the first Wednesday in October of that year, the same October quality of light falling across the yard, Marcella finished the delivery log and closed her ledger and came out onto the porch where he was sitting with his coffee in the early evening. She sat down beside him on the porch step, the way she had once sat beside him on a different porch step at the edge of a lantern-lit harvest social, a stranger with cold cider and a hurt that she was holding carefully. She was not a stranger now. She was the person he knew most completely in the world, whose silences he could read and whose determinations he could recognize and whose laughter he had been collecting for years, storing each instance of it with the care of someone who knows the value of what they are keeping. She leaned her shoulder against his. He put his arm around her. The October evening was cool and clear, the creek making its quiet sound down the slope, the cottonwoods going gold along the bank. "I was thinking about the social," she said. "The year we met, the Harvest Social, you were so entirely determined not to be there," she said. "And yet," he said. "And yet," she agreed. They sat on the porch steps in the October dusk, and the land settled into its evening, and above them, the first stars appeared in the deep blue above the horizon, one and then two and then the whole inevitable cascade of them, and the life they had built together on this land went on being what it was. Solid, living, chosen, true. The most reluctant man at the social sat on his own porch steps with his wife against his shoulder and watched the stars come out over the Kansas plain and understood, with the whole quiet certainty of a man who has at last come home, that the best things in his life had arrived not when he had pursued them but when he had, despite everything, stayed.